Hello, welcome back to another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm your host, Stephen Roy Goodman. I'm here in Oslo, Norway, where we're going to be speaking about urban analytics. And specifically, I'm at a university called Oslo Metropolitan University. And I'm here with Claudia, Hedwig, Yamu, who's a professor of urban analytics. And let's get right into it. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I guess I wanted to start with the issue of planning versus organic growth. So my understanding in terms of urban analytics and urban planning is that there's a kind of school of thought that says we ought to plan things, and a school of thought that says we ought to do kind of let cities grow organically. How do you deal with that, one, in the classroom, and how do you deal with that in terms of advising?
So actually this debate has been going on for quite a while within the community, and if we look at cities historically, they always have been a mixture, always between organic growth and planned. We also would call this like more bottom-up approach, where we say it's organically grown versus a top-down approach. And organically grown cities also refer very much to the logic of nature, you know, how people behave, how they optimize cities, how they put the locations of their shops in cities, which of course there are a lot of theories behind it. Why would you optimize your shop in a certain way? But I'm a firm believer in, and this is also what I have shown over time, is one of the potential ways to approach this is simply by having a very good combination, because nature is smart. So what we want to do is, on one hand, we need to plan cities to optimize them in a way also given, you know, the current sustainability, you know, we have climate change, etc. So we really want to create sustainable cities, while at the same time also create opportunities for people to make choices and have decision on, going back to my example, where, for example, to locate shops. So what we need actually is that we kind of govern, you know, organic growth. What it also, and I think this is very important to mention here, is also that we overplanned cities can be as bad as unplanned cities. So one extreme example I've been also working in practice with about unplanned cities are, for example, informal settlements. And we have seen this all over the world, that informal settlements, or slums to say so, also can really have many social problems, you know, have also economic issues of, given the physical structure, not providing the opportunities, the equal of opportunities for people to access job, leisure, or other amenities.
But that's interesting, but I guess when you said that, I was thinking of the issue of the growth of the populations and jobs.
Right.
So how do we plan for future growth of jobs when people might have to take 2 hours to commute into a city?
Yes, absolutely. So that's also a very, very important question nowadays. So it's very much about accessibility. Accessibility, like I just mentioned, to jobs, accessibility to education, accessibility also to leisure amenities. And accessibility we can divide into the so-called like short trips. Where can I walk to the next shop? So it is the idea of the walkable city, also to reduce energy use, and it's also called the long trips, which would be very well supported by public transport means, right? And we also do have within this package, I would say, of accessibility in cities, which is one of the most important, I would say, it's the amateur of the city next to land use, is how can I get somewhere, very simply speaking. It's also the first and last mile problem. Do I have access to public transport if I have to go across the city? And I mean, it's very well known in big cities that very often people commute 1 to 2 hours to their office. So it's really up to us planners to plan and make cities efficient in terms of accessibility, centrality of locations, where we have like important services, ergo land use in there, and also public transport. So all in all, we would call this the infrastructure of the city, the street network of the city, and this in combination with land use, but not to forget also so-called green and blue infrastructure, which is, for example, like nature or water. Also, you know, it's very important for the environment that people also feel well in cities and good quality of life.
But that quality of life certainly would be viewed differently depending on where we were having this conversation. We're in Oslo, but if we were in New York City, perhaps people would look at this differently than they would in Los Angeles, or they would in or a big city in Germany, or a big city or Tokyo, let's say. So how do you deal with your work in terms of, if I understand this correctly, you're taking a lot of data to analyze these pressure points. How do you then take that data and help the decision makers do that in a way that might be different from city to city?
Yes. So actually there are two possible ways, right? On one hand, we collect primary data. So we can use also so-called secondary data, which we got like governmental statistical data, for example. They are called secondary data. Or we also use primary data, which we really collect. So it also gives you the idea of the context. So the context and also, of course, the history of the city, as well as the governmental structure, it's all a bit of interwoven and intertwined in urban planning, is very, very important. So the primary data already gives us a hint if there might appear some kind of, let's call them urban problems, right? On the other hand, what we also do, and I think this is very important, and also to tackle these pressuring topics, as you just mentioned, is also the co-creation with citizens. We need to respond to citizen needs. And every city, you know, has a different context, and also given, you know, the different means of that, it also means how can the citizen help us co-create? How can they tell us and respond to us what they actually need for their city in terms to provide quality of life, what citizens or residents, let's say residents, I like the term more, what residents do need. So we also, as urban planners, we are mediators, and at the same time we also need to listen. We need to have residents involved in urban planning. We need to respond to their needs, and there are a lot of techniques how actually to get residents involved into urban planning processes.
As you're saying that, I'm thinking of my role as a resident and a citizen in Washington, D.C., and many years ago there was a debate about trees and about how to protect the tree canopy.
Right.
And as a private citizen, I was involved in that because I like trees and I like to protect trees. But presumably other people had different opinions about that. So how do we get lots of opinions about those sorts of things?
Yes, very often in planning you meet different stakeholders with different visions and very often also competing visions. So again, we are back to the idea of the mediator, so how to deal with that. Data analytics, for example, is very suitable also to test different visions. We can analyze different perspectives on, for example, you know, trees are very important for the urban microclimate, you know, shadowing, you know, all these canopies, as you just mentioned. So we can analyze different visions of different stakeholders. But, for example, just to give you an example, you can also conduct a charrette, which is a workshop that allows you to involve stakeholders and citizens in order to approach a problem-solving approach or to use a problem-solving approach to come up at the end of such a workshop which has a certain logic with a feasible plan. And yes, sometimes we can resolve, and yes, sometimes we need to compromise. And it's also about, you know, find the best compromise for the resident, find the best compromise for our near future and also for a long-term future. You know, we are in service as urban planners, creating guidelines into that future. So it's all about also from data to policy, from data in terms to support decision makers to visualize what the vision is about. It's also a communication tool in order to find and build consensus with all stakeholders. So it's also, I'm very, very firm believer also that we have democratic processes in urban planning, and it becomes more and more important to tackle nowadays pressuring points also in cities.
Well, that's interesting. And as you're saying that, I was thinking about how hard that would be to do and how hard that would be to do for an undergraduate student or a graduate student at a university, whether it's Oslo Met or the University of the District of Columbia or the University of Maryland or the University of Virginia. That would be very difficult to have a student learn how to do. How do you help students take those future roles?
Yes, it's all about training. So of course, for example, let's speak about the master program. We start with fundamentals, right? We start with different research traditions. We start with different schools of thought. You know, there have been a lot of schools of thought in the European context, in the American context, very famous one, very popular ones, and the very important ones. It's like a toolbox. You need to learn the student the toolbox. Once you can use a hammer, right? You can use it in order to fix a wall, or, you know, to break down the wall, or whatever you want to do it. So it's learning about tools. It's also learning about the basis in order to use and to apply them. Of course, this data analytics is then enriched with courses and trainings on urban policy. So students need to learn about these processes. And then we can build up and say, if we have these processes, if we have how to write policy recommendations, what does it mean? What are the different stands within there? What are the different traditions? Then we can go a step further and say, look, these are this kind of techniques you can apply to bring together urban analytics, from data to policy, to get feasible plans, to write a policy recommendation, and then you learn them these techniques and you kind of simulate it in the classroom. But you also go out, you invite stakeholders, you have podiums discussions, you go to governmental offices, you know, you try students to get them very close to practice, to allow to observe or to apprenticeship somewhere. So this is also very important in this whole educational process. On one hand, theory, methods, combined with practice experience.
And do you have specific students who you're mentoring both in the classroom and then in kind of one-on-one as well?
Yes, absolutely. It always also depends on the content of the different courses and the class, yes.
And then I realize we're talking at Oslo Met, but in other universities in Norway, are they also doing this?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Even curricula differ, of course, and classroom sizes differs. It's very much related to the content, you know. Depending on the content, you have different methods of teaching.
Well, and to get back to the issue of the kind of connection between the community, I mean, I think that's really interesting, because if you think about the example that you used about the different stakeholders, there are always going to be different stakeholders.
Right,
and
yes.
So it's going to be very difficult for a student who's learning how to do this to navigate. Like, there would be no way that I would possibly understand all the subtle things going on in Oslo, Norway today. I have trouble enough following that in Washington, D.C., and I live in Washington. There are so many different competing interests and needs. I guess what I wanted to delve into a little bit more is, how do we train somebody specifically to do that? Because it's hard for a politician to do it. It's hard for someone who works for the city or the government to do that. How do we train students at universities to develop the subtle skills with the specific scientific skills? Because it seems to me that that's quite difficult.
It is, absolutely, absolutely. And it also takes a lot of experience over time. And of course, students and future experts actually have to grow in that role. Absolutely. But I think one very important point here is communication skills. How do you communicate complex problems. How do you communicate, with different stakeholders? And we also practice this. So we invite stakeholders to, for example, be part of a jury in a kind of analytical design studio, It's get into discussion. So it's a step-by-step process. But yes, it has to be trained. It has to be trained in a safe environment, where students can express themselves and also train their communication tools in order to understand and be aware as planners. On one hand, they're policy analysts. On the other hand, they are data analysts, but they are also mediators. And mediation also means skills in communication, skills in presentation, and also combined, the communication skills are also combined with data visualization.
And in terms of the data visualization, how am I visualizing this? How can I see this? Like, how can I understand? I understand that 20 people walked by a street this morning at a certain hour. But what happens with the data after that? What happens after that? How do I visualize that? And how do you visualize that as a planner?
There are, again, different techniques, but of course you can do a color-coded visualization, which is a very simple, for example, I always use the example of a traffic light. So from green is good, red is bad, that's a very popular way, which actually every resident also understands, because we're in the service of the residents, we're in the service of the stakeholders. So we need to develop also a communication tool, which is also very understandable. And I think it's very important. All this, I call it always the complex backend, all this data is very interesting for us and the numbers, but for the residents, we need to develop very much color-coded maps and plans for them in a language, so we translate it that they at one glimpse really get, intuitively, what does this specific vision means of a certain stakeholder? Or is this representing my vision as a resident, for example, if we visualize with data visions of residents in cities, if we have like a co-creation workshop with residents. And I think this is very important. There are also experts existing which are part of this workshop, which actually visualize the ideas. So it's a translation from data, language, in terms of how the idea is expressed, into maps.
And could you use one of those maps, for instance, to encourage people to walk down a particular street or drive down a particular street versus a different street?
Yes, actually there are two means in this. On one hand, we can trigger or put in incentives. So we know if we do or if we create or plan a street a certain way, as you just used as example, it will give an incentive to people, because maybe the street is very walkable. I don't have to cross the zebra, my sidewalk is wide enough, I have lovely trees, I have lovely facades there, so it's also very engaging with me as a pedestrian. I have wonderful little local shops there. It's just a joy to walk there. Even maybe it's like 2 or 3 minutes long in terms of walk, then I would take another route. So there are a lot of different incentives in terms of structure and land use and so-called block sizes. So how do we organize the structure in a city in order to give incentives to people, which also means their behavior. On the other hand, it's very important also to create awareness. So I think very much nowadays our work is also about creating awareness because we all live in societies where we have certain norms and social values. Very often we are not even aware because we grew up in a certain environment. The environment shapes us, of course, socially. And creating awareness is also one, I think, of the very important means for urban planners within their field of work.
Well, you mentioned incentives. Could we talk a little bit about that? So what would be an example of an incentive? A tax incentive, or an incentive in terms of beauty, or an incentive in terms of an efficient commute to work?
Actually, it can be all of that. It can be a tax incentives. Let me give you here an example from Norway, electric cars. We're the capital worldwide with the capital with the highest numbers of electric cars. So why is it so popular to buy an electric car in Norway? First of all, it's tax-free. So you get it nowhere cheaper in the world, really nice and decent electric cars. Second of all, parking is cheap. Third of all, charging my car is either for free or at a very low price, so it's also very cheap. So this already gives initially the incentive to say, oh, it's actually more efficient for me, while at the same time I do something for the environment to buy an electric car. So that would be a policy incentive, right? So governmental, top-down. The other incentives you're talking about is, yes, beauty. Beauty is very important. So how it's also linked to quality of life. What is the quality of my environment? If I have a nice and high quality of my environment, I like to walk. At the same time, it's very healthy for me as an individual. If I walk down the street, or if I take every day a walk, or if I walk to my job, maybe these 20 minutes a day, they add up for my health. And you know, health and cities also have been a huge discussion in urban planning. So I can put incentives with green infrastructure, blue infrastructure, also nature, parks. I mentioned it already, local shops, you know, which are nice. We call it also active frontages. You see people sitting in a cafe, you know, you're not having this kind of industrial walls. So it's a very lively environment, which really can also be an incentive for people to walk.
But what about people who don't have a voice? What about the people who either, one, don't come to the meetings to discuss this, or two, are really the kind of poorer people in society who generally are in housing that's not as nice, or parts of a city that aren't as nice? How do we hear their voices?
Absolutely. I've been actually doing research in this field, and I think that's very important. It's about equality. I think we're very much also in service, or as urban planners, we're in service of the people, right? So we serve society. If we're dealing with the built environment, you know, more than half of the world's population is living in cities. And we have to get out, get on the street, and we have to get those people who do not have a voice, invite them to co-creation, invite them to urban planning processes. And research I've done with my team actually was doing exactly that. We went to informal settlements. We went there. We collected data you would normally not have by any means of statistical data, this kind of secondary data as I mentioned before. So we went there. We spoke with people. We did interviews with people. We asked them for their needs. We looked at their accessibility to education, and we actually found exactly that very often it's also influenced by social norms and values. So we have to go out there, we have to identify the problems, and we have to find solutions for this and give those people a voice, you know, be the advocate for those people who do not have a voice. And on the other hand, it's also very important in terms of policies. What kind of policies are in place? For example, in Norway, there is, for the people who cannot afford proper housing, there's housing allowance. So there can be policies can support people, because everyone has the right for good quality housing in Norway. It's a basic right.
Now, this may be a difference between a European city and an American city,
Yeah.
but in the United States, we have quite a problem with people who don't have housing. We call people homeless. We have a lot of people who are homeless, who have no homes. But they tend to go to cities.
Yeah.
What do you advocate in terms of helping students and people who are other citizens and other residents who are homeless?
I think this is really also about a democratic process. So how is our democratic system set up? What kind of choices do we make in terms of our democratic system we're living in order to trigger also that those policies are written? Because the problem very often is, in order also to accommodate poor people with, you know, quality housing is we have policies in place that are very fragmented. So what we need actually is a very combined approach. We need a national policy framework where all these sub-policies you just mentioned, you know, from different municipalities, regional ones, etc., fit in very well in order to tackle those problems. It's really also a political topic, and planning is political at the same time, where we also are data analysts, but it's also political. It has a political dimension. And I think that's very important to be aware. How do we write our policies? What kind of policy recommendations also we as urban planners give?
And speaking of that, it seems to me, and that sounds about right to me, but it seems to me that whoever is the politician in charge in whatever jurisdiction, whether it's in the United States or Europe or Asia or Africa or elsewhere, they might give us constraints that, and specifically you constraints, that would say that you have to come up with policy recommendations within a particular political view. How do you deal with it at that point?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I've been familiar with these constraints, absolutely. So on one hand, you try just, you know, to get the best out of it and stretch it as far as you can within the given constraints and guidelines you have to work with, and really try to visualize different strategies, different scenarios, and really optimize the best you can within a given framework. On the other hand, you know, the second stand would be you visualize the problem to the stakeholder with data, so decision support, in order to support the politician to create awareness and to support the politician in making the right decision for all. You know, so it's always a bit of a negotiation between the two camps, of course. You know, so how do I deal within a given framework and my constraints, and how can I be very convincing with data in order to give an incentive or be an agent of change? I think that's also very important as an urban planner, be an agent of change.
Well, and speaking of an agent of change, I think we only have a few minutes left, but before you've been very generous with your time. So, but I'm looking right here at a book. This is your book.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you've written in this book and what you'd like us, one, to learn from it, and two, where we can get it?
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen, to give me this opportunity. Wonderful, thank you very much. This is a book about space syntax. It's a theory and method that actually allows you to do social spatial analysis. So it actually links the spatial with the social component in urban planning. It's based on a street network analysis, but it also allows you to link it to land use and how would people behave in terms of the movement in city. It has been successful in the last 30 to 40 years to apply in urban planning in research and practice. So it's applied in practice worldwide, and it's open access. I believe we should have access, you know, knowledge should be available for all. So you can just download it for free from the website of the publisher. Just please type in the name or the title of it, Introduction to Space Syntax in Urban Studies, and you can just download it for free. It's a textbook. It's mainly written for students with examples from all over the world. The audience are master and PhD students mainly. Thank you.
Well, thank you. This has been really an interesting segment, so I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to speak with you.
Well, thank you. And if you would like additional information about Claudia or any of her colleagues at Oslo Met, please go to oslomet.no. If you would like to send a note to me at the show, please go ahead and do so by sending an email to highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. And thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. I'm Stephen Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.